Hey legends, I should be a relatively quick video on the benefits of international trade. So let's get into it. All right, the first benefit here is lower prices for consumers. And for each of these benefits, I've given you a key idea at the top that I really want you to talk to in your answers. So the key idea with lower prices for consumers is it gives local producers an incentive to innovate. All right, so what do I mean by that? Well, and this first benefit is really at the heart of the overall benefit of international trade and free trade agreements. And so if you kind of get a general question of, why is international trade a good thing? This is kind of the one I want you to talk to, okay? It's often it seems easy to talk to. Oh, international trade is great because we've got, access to more things overseas, but that's not at the heart of what kind of international trade and trade liberalization, which is a concept later on, is all about. All right, so let's talk to this one if you can. Otherwise, if you're pointed to the other ones, then you can talk about them. So what's this one all about? Well, when we have open borders and international trade, it exposes Australian businesses to more competition. So when you're not just competing with other businesses within your country, but also those from other countries, well, you've got an incentive to innovate your internal business processes to save money, to save costs and lower costs. So local businesses, when they're exposed to international competition, they have to increase their individual productivity to keep prices low. And remember that term productivity is all about maximizing resource use for maximum output. Yeah, so you're squeezing as much as you can out of the resources that you've got. Okay, so and when businesses increase their productivity, they can either have the same amount of resources on the inside and create more output, which is a good thing, or they'll use less resources for the same amount of output. And both of those situations save costs for a business, and then they can pass on those cost savings in the form of lower prices. Now, those lower prices are to maintain international competitiveness, and we benefit from that. Okay, because if we can get a cheaper price from another country, then we're going to do that. And so when businesses are exposed, then it forces them to increase productivity and downward pressure on prices. The second benefit is greater choice for consumers. This is normally the go-to for a lot of students because it seems the easiest. But unless you're specifically asked to talk about this one, I wouldn't because it's not the biggest impact one of the four that we have. This one's pretty straightforward. How you just have increased access to goods and services that you ordinarily wouldn't have if you had closed borders. And a really good example of this is North Korea with dear leader Kim Jong Un. So they have a relatively closed border system, and their people are in poverty because there's very few countries that have all of the resources that they need to maintain a high level of living standards. So most countries need to trade. Yeah, so they need to trade in order to have greater choice and increase their access to goods and services, thereby increasing their material living standards. And international trade allows countries to do that. The next one is achieve economies of scale. Now, this is a tricky one, so I've broken it down into kind of a few steps. So what the key idea with this particular one is, what economies of scale is, well, first of all, what is economies of scale? Please don't think that economies of scale is a big economy. Yeah, that's not what this phrase is about. What economies of scale means, let's break this phrase down. Scale means size. Yeah, if you're looking at something on a big scale, it's actually very big. And economies mean it's more along the lines of actual productivity and how well something is economically viable. So don't think about whole economy here per se, because economies of scale applies to individual businesses as well. And those that study business management will know that later in the year. Okay, so how does international trade achieve economies of scale? Well, what it does is it enables businesses, and this is the key idea, to have lower fixed costs of production in the areas that this economy has a comparative advantage. So there's a lot that we're going to unpack there. So lower fixed cost of production, let's talk about that. So a fixed cost of production is the cost that a business has to make something, irrespective of how many they make. So businesses will always have costs, and some of those costs are just fixed, whether you make one thing or 10 million things. And what a economies of scale means is when I'm making lots of something, I'm averaging out those fixed costs over more products. Okay, so that's idea number one. Idea number two is this idea of comparative advantage, in that countries do want to specialize in the things they have a comparative advantage in. So let's break that phrase down. Comparative sounds like the word compare, and advantage is, well, you have an advantage when you're good at something. So what this phrase means is comparative advantage are areas that, compared to other countries, your own country is very efficient at making. And if we're very efficient at making these things, well, we can make lots of them, even more than our domestic market needs. And then so therefore we can lower our fixed cost of production even more. So what does that look like? Okay, I use like a water bottle example for this one. It's a bit silly, but hear me out. If you were wanting to start a water bottle company and you only wanted to make one water bottle, you'd be crazy, but let's just hear me out. The cost of making that one water bottle, let's just say to set that business up, is $2 million. Split out between the fixed and variable costs, like to get your machinery and factory and all that kind of stuff all ready to go, is going to cost you just under $2 million. And the variable costs are actually quite small, because you only need a little bit of plastic, you only need a little bit of electricity, and you probably only need one staff member. You don't need many variable costs at all. And then so the price of that water bottle, if you're adding on, yeah, it costs you 2 million. And if you're adding on 50% on every price on every water bottle, well, how much are you going to have to sell that water bottle for? 3 million bucks. Your cost is 2 million, you're only selling one, and so therefore for you to get a 50% profit margin, you're going to have to sell that, 50% markup, you're going to have to sell that for $3 million for one water bottle. That doesn't sound too good, does it? However, we're probably not just going to make one water bottle. Let's just say your factory is going to make 10 million water bottles. Let's go through that same exercise. Well, your fixed costs are the same. Yeah, that's why they're fixed. They don't change depending on how much stuff you make. And so just under $2 million is your fixed costs. If you take that same price, I think it was half a cent in variable costs, I think I did the calculation on, across 10 million units, well, you've got $50,000 now in variable costs. If I add that first number and that second number, and then put 50% on top of that, and divide it by 10 million, that's going to give me the price at which I can now sell every water bottle for, with a 50% markup, just like before. But instead of me having to sell that water bottle for 3 million, I now only need to sell it for 31 cents. Because those fixed costs that don't change have just been spread out over so many products, it enables me to lower my cost of production per unit and therefore lower my price. So having a larger market to sell to, yeah, so with international trade, I've got the whole world I can now sell my water bottles to, more than just the 25 million people that live in Australia. And so as a result, my fixed costs per unit fall. I can then pass on those cost savings and achieve economies of scale. And then the final one here is access to more resources. This one's a pretty straightforward one, and it links into something we've already learnt. And this is just essentially businesses and governments can access more land, labour and capital resources than they ordinarily could if we had closed borders. This directly links through to quality and quantity of resources, which is a factor that shifts the aggregate supply curve, and it's going to change the ability to supply and willingness. For example, businesses are able to utilize really, really smart people from around the world to come up with brand new vaccines or technologies to improve whatever. Now, you're not just taking from the labour force within Australia, you're taking from the labour force of the world when we have international trade, and that has improvements in aggregate supply and therefore GDP and therefore living standards. So those are the 4 reasons, guys. Couple are easy. A few more are a bit trickier. Know them all well, but that first one is your go-to if you ever have a general thing of where are we? Whoops, this one here, of the incentive to innovate. Okay, that's the one I want you to focus on if you get a general question on what is a benefit of international trade. Thanks, guys. See ya.